Okay, class, this is hopefully our last video for the introduction to anatomy. We've covered a lot of material this first day of class. We are going to end with our serous membranes. These are also called aka serosa. So our serous membranes, what are they? Well, first, they are only located in your ventral body cavities, so in the thoracic and abdominal cavities. They are thin, double membranes that are associated with those organs that have movement in some fashion. Now, in the thoracic cavity, what organs are moving? Well, you have your lungs that are going in, out, every time you inhale and exhale. And the heart, obviously, it's beating all the time. So this is a pretty tight space in here. So we need to surround these organs with membranes that are going to help prevent friction. We want to create a frictionless environment in this thoracic cavity. In the abdominal cavity, there are organs in here that are moving too. The stomach, when you eat, it is moving back and forth, back and forth. The intestines, those are constantly moving. So we need to create a frictionless environment in the abdominal cavity also. So that is what our serous membranes are helping us to accomplish. So let's kind of look at what they are looking like. So this is a good example. If you have a balloon filled with air and you stick your fist through it, and just imagine this is an organ in one of your ventral body cavities. This will kind of represent this double membrane, this serosa. One thing you need to know that, let me move this over a little bit. One thing you need to know, all organs in the ventral body cavities, they are called visceral organs. So any organ in a ventral body cavity is, quote, a visceral organ. Just get that out of the way. So here is our serous membrane, a double membrane. It is surrounding our visceral organ. So we are going to call this outer membrane, represented by the balloon here, the outer balloon wall, we're going to call it the parietal serosa. Parietal refers to a wall, a partition. Just think of a partition, a wall. So this is going to be the parietal serosa, the outside. Now this parietal serosa is going to double back in and form our inner layer, this inner layer where the hand is going through, that's surrounding the hand. This is going to represent the visceral serosa. If you see the name visceral, you know it has to do with that organ. This is the visceral organ. The visceral serosa is in intimate contact with that organ. Now, in between these two layers, the outer parietal and the inner visceral layer, you will have this space. Now, in the balloon here, that space is filled with air. But in the serous membrane, this space in between the visceral and parietal layers is going to have serous fluid. This is a space, a cavity. It's a serous cavity, And within this serous cavity, this space, is serous fluid. What is serous fluid? Think of serous fluid as a lubricant. That's basically what it is. It's a lubricant. It's helping prevent friction from this moving organ. So these visceral organs have their personal lubricant in this serous cavity. Remember, serous fluid in the serous cavity. That serous fluid is like a lubricant. So we're going to start with the serous membrane of the lung first. The serous membrane of the lung is called the pleura. You hear that word pleura, you automatically just have to think of the lung. If you are making cards, index cards, this would be a good index card. The serous membrane of the lung is called the pleura. Now, if the fist is representing one lung here, say this is one lung, the outer membrane is going, ooh, boy, did I screw that up. Let me change that. Okay, I fixed the mistake. This outer layer of the pleura is called the parietal pleura. Remember, parietal is always on the outside. It is the wall. This parietal pleura is lining the thoracic cavity wall. The inner layer is going to be called the visceral pleura. Visceral, it's surrounding the organ. The organ is the lung. That's why we say pleura, visceral pleura. So when you hear those terms, parietal pleura, you should automatically think this is the outer serous membrane that's surrounding the lung. The visceral pleura is the inner serous membrane right on top of the lung. In between these two layers is going to be the pleural cavity, because this is the lung. Pleural refers to the lung. AL, adjective. Remember what kind of cavity? A pleural cavity. This is filled with serous fluid. What is serous fluid? It acts as a lubricant. Now remember, when we're talking about our thoracic cavity, we said within the thoracic cavity are two pleural cavities. Each pleural cavity contains one lung. This is the pleural cavity where we have the serous fluid. Inside of it is a lung. We have two pleural cavities. We have two lungs. Now here's a drawing that's pretty good. Let me get a little closer. What I don't like about most of these drawings is this is a 2D representation of something that is 3D. I am very visual. I need to touch things. I need to see things in 3D and hold them in my hand. That's one of the benefits of being in our classroom is you can actually see these structures much better. But I'll try to go through these so hopefully you can visualize them a little bit better. Think of this as this brown part right here is the thoracic wall of the thoracic cavity. Here is the diaphragm. Here is the mediastinum. Remember, we said the mediastinum is that region in between the two pleural cavities. Here is our double membrane. Here is our serosa of the lungs, so it's called the pleura. The outer layer, remember, is called the parietal pleura. It is in intimate contact with the thoracic wall. It is touching. It is in contact with that thoracic wall. And then it comes down and it's in intimate contact with the diaphragm. Then it goes up and it's in contact with the mediastinum. It wraps back around and becomes the visceral pleura. The visceral pleura is clinging to the lung. Here is the lung. In between the parietal and visceral pleura is the pleural cavity. This little space, the pleural cavity, which contains what? Serous fluid. Here's another diagram that I pulled off the internet. Here's the mediastinum. Here they have the blue, which is representing the parietal pleura. You can see here's the ribs. Here's the muscles in between the ribs. So this parietal pleura has intimate contact with the thoracic cage and the diaphragm, and the mediastinum wraps back around. Now we have the visceral pleura, and the white space in between is the pleural cavity filled with that serous fluid, which is a lubricant. Oops. So this is another picture. I'm trying to show you multiple pictures so you can kind of visualize this. Here they're actually showing you the parietal and visceral pleura. They've cut a window through it so you can see these two layers. Here is the outer parietal pleura. Here is the visceral pleura right on top of the lungs. And in between the parietal and visceral pleura is going to be the pleural cavity, where we are going to be having our serous fluid, our lubricant. That is going to be the pleural cavity, that space in between these two layers. Now I have a video that's showing you more of a 3D representation. So I am going to click on my link and take you to that video.
Hi, my name is Jody Chapman, and I'm here with Dr. Ricardo Gonzalez-Rothi to give you an inside look into the pleura and the pleural space. What is the pleura exactly?
The pleura is a continuous membrane of cells that folds over onto itself at the apex and at the base of each lung.
What is the pleural space?
Well, the pleural space is a potential space that's between the parietal pleura that lines the inside of the chest wall and the visceral pleura that lines the lungs as the two pleural membranes fold upon themselves.
What are the functions of the pleura and the pleural space?
The pleural space helps regulate the pressure inside and outside the lungs during breathing. It is thought that the fluid in the space provides lubrication for the pleural surfaces on the lungs and the chest wall as they slide against each other during the breathing cycle.
How much fluid is in the pleural space?
This visceral space is estimated to hold between 8 and 10 milliliters of fluid per side in an average sized adult man. So it's not very much fluid. And under normal circumstances, that amount is held at a pretty fairly constant volume.
Well, I hope that video helped you visualize what these serous membranes are a little bit better, especially with the lung. Now we're going to go on to the serous membranes of the heart. Now, the serous membrane around the heart is called the pericardium. This is, you know this word. Peri means what? Peri means around. Cardi means heart. Tells us it's a noun. So the pericardium is the serous membrane around the heart. It's basically just like the lung. If the fist represents the heart, this inner lining would now be called the visceral pericardium. The outer layer would be called the parietal pericardium, and this space in between the two layers is called the pericardial cavity. That pericardial cavity is where we have our serous fluid. So this is our lubricant around the heart in this pericardial cavity. So remember, we said that the pericardial cavity is located within the mediastinum of the thoracic cavity. So in the thoracic cavity, we have our two pleural cavities. We have this region called the mediastinum. Within the mediastinum, we have several structures. Remember, the esophagus runs here. The trachea, the air tube that takes air in and out of the lungs, is in here. The great big blood vessels that take blood in and out of the heart is here. And we have the pericardial cavity is within here. So this picture is showing you, here's the outline of the mediastinum in the black little dots. And here we have the pericardium shown in brown. We have our inner visceral pericardium, outer parietal pericardium, and that space in between them is the pericardial cavity that has our serous fluid. So not too bad, right? Now we get to the serous membrane in the abdominal cavity. Now this is complicated, and all I want you to know at this point is the serous membrane around most of the abdominal organs is called the peritoneum. Now, it also has a parietal peritoneum and a visceral peritoneum, but now we are covering multiple abdominal organs. So this outer layer, the parietal peritoneum, if we follow it, it's this turquoise blue. You can kind of see it lining the abdominal cavity. So it's lining this entire abdominal cavity. It's going over the bladder. This is the bladder, and this is the uterus. This is a female. So it's going over the bladder, over the uterus, and over the rectum. So remember, this is all in the pelvic cavity. So this parietal peritoneum is surrounding the abdominal cavity, going over the pelvic cavity, and it's surrounding the backside of the abdominal cavity also. And then it's going to wrap around on itself to become the visceral peritoneum. Now we are covering lots of different organs. Here it's covering the liver. This is showing you covering the stomach, and then it's going to be covering some part of the intestines here, and then it's going to be covering all of the small intestines. Very complicated to even visualize, but all you need to know is you have this parietal peritoneum lining the abdominal cavity and the visceral peritoneum lining most of the organs in the abdominal cavity. And the space in between them, which is this white part, this is going to be the peritoneal cavity. Peritoneal cavity is filled with serous fluid. So this is just a recap. Make sure you understand all these. It's not that hard. Just get it, wrap your head around it, and you say these words out loud. So if I give you the name, the serosa that's surrounding the lung, you would call it what? The pleura. The serosa surrounding the heart is the pericardium. The serosa surrounding the abdominal organs, the abdominal cavity, is the peritoneum. Serosa, aka the serous membranes. Where are they located? Where's the pleura located? In the thoracic cavity. Where's the pericardium located? In the mediastinum. Remember, the mediastinum is within the thoracic cavity. And the peritoneum is located in that abdominal cavity. And then just remember, the outer layer is always going to, the outer layer of any serous membrane is going to start with the word parietal. If it's the lung, it's the parietal pleura. It's the heart, it's the parietal pericardium. If it's in the abdominal cavity, it's the parietal peritoneum. The inner layer that's right on top of the organ is going to be start with visceral. Visceral, because remember, viscera refers to organ. So if it's right on top of the lung, the visceral pleura. Right on top of the heart, the visceral pericardium. Right on top of one of the multitude of organs in the abdominal cavity, the visceral peritoneum. That serous cavity that contains the lubricant, the serous fluid. In the lungs, it's the pleural cavity. The heart, the pericardial cavity. In the abdominal, around the abdominal organs, it's the peritoneal cavity. I am going to finish off this video with an actual dissection. So actually you'll see a cadaver, and you'll see some structures you don't know yet, but I just want to give you a general overview of what the thoracic cavity looks like and what these serous membranes in the thoracic cavity look like. We're not going to be looking at the abdominal cavity, way too complicated, but we'll at least see the thoracic cavity in a cadaver. So let's go to the cadaver.
We're going to move deeper into the body and expose the organs that live in the thoracic cavity. And just as a reminder of the things that you've looked at already, of course, we've got our lateral abdominal wall musculature and the musculature of the chest, including the pectoralis major muscles. You've already cut their origins and reflected those away, as well as the deeper pectoralis minor muscles, preserving their nerves and vessels. Now we're ready to remove the anterior and lateral portions of the rib cage, the bony rib cage, so that you can expose the heart and lungs within the thoracic cavity. Now we've already made the cuts, but what you're going to do to make this happen is to cut through the ribs and the intercostal muscles around the perimeter of the rib cage on each side. And if you make the cuts or your ultimate hole as large as possible by following the margin of the rib cage and then going down as far laterally as you can along the side, essentially along the mid-axillary line, you'll have nice exposure of the thoracic organs for your further dissection. Now, as you do this, if you can, you should try and get your fingers within the hole and peel the layer of tissue, the parietal pleura, away from its attachment to the inside of the rib cage so that you can leave as much of that intact as possible as you remove the bones. Now let's go ahead and take away the ribs and the intercostal muscles on each side, and you'll get an idea of what you're going to see once you've completed that part of the dissection. Now we do have some holes within the parietal pleura here, but you can see essentially what it's going to look like. There are some areas that are thinner, almost transparent, and some areas that are pathological in this individual where they've thickened up, probably because of some sort of infection within the sac surrounding the lung. This would be the parietal pleura, the outer layer of the sac that surrounds and protects the lungs. If we take that away, you can see the nice, delicate visceral pleura that's immediately on the surface of the lung, and we'll have a nice friction-free movement as the lung fills with air and then releases it during exhalation. The next step in the process will be to remove the sternum from the midline, and to do this, depending on whether or not the cadaver that you're working on has had osteoporosis, you may need to use a saw to cut at the inferior and superior ends of the sternum. Alternatively, you might be able to use a chisel and a hammer to cut through these areas. Again, be sure that you try and bluntly separate the soft tissue from the deep surface of the sternum as you do so. Now with the bony part of the rib cage removed, we can see very nicely the two lungs on either side within the chest and the heart right along the midline. And we have preserved the internal thoracic artery and vein on either side in this situation. So during the next step of the dissection, what we're going to do is remove the lungs. And you should be careful to, again, preserve the internal thoracic arteries. And another structure that we hope that you can keep for the entire semester if possible, and that is a nerve that you'll find traveling inferiorly to reach the diaphragm, which it innervates. And this nerve, called the phrenic nerve, travels between the lung and the heart. Okay, you're going to find one on the right and one on the left. So that as you progress to removing the lung and cutting it out of the body, make sure you know where the phrenic nerve is at all times and keep it out of the way so that we can keep that intact. Now to remove the lung, if you can just push it laterally, pull the heart in medially, now you can see the region of the lung called the hilus here. And this is where a variety of structures enter or exit the organ, including the airway, the blood vessels, the nerves, the lymphatics. So that what we want to do is make a nice clean cut at the hilus of the lung so we can then remove it from the body. But again, push the lung out laterally, pull the heart in medially, and use a knife or a scalpel to cut through the structures at the hilus. We've put the left lung back into the chest so that we can think a bit more about the pleural sac that surrounds the lung. Of course, it's the visceral layer of the pleural sac that's immediately on the surface of the organ, but in terms of that outer layer, the parietal layer, we can give it different names depending on which surface it's coating within the thoracic cavity. For example, that portion of the parietal pleura that is adherent to the inside of the rib cage is called the costal pleura. That portion of the parietal pleura that coats the superior surface of the diaphragm is the diaphragmatic pleura. And on the midline, between the lung and the heart, we've got a portion of the parietal pleura called the mediastinal pleura. Now take a look at how much of the thoracic cavity the lung occupies. It really doesn't occupy the entire height of the thoracic cavity. It falls a little bit short. Now that we've removed the lungs, essentially everything that you see remaining here in the midline of the chest cavity is in a region called the mediastinum, and this would include the heart. Now the heart, like the lungs, is surrounded by a sac called the pericardial sac that will reduce the friction as the heart enlarges and contracts again. And I've got the scissors holding onto the outer layer of the parietal pericardium, and to expose the heart itself, we need to cut through the parietal pericardium, and we'll see the visceral pericardium right on the surface of the heart. As you do this, once again, be careful not to cut the phrenic nerve innervating the diaphragm, and try to keep those internal thoracic vessels intact as well. So I'm simply going to make a large X-shaped cut within the pericardial sac and flip back those flaps to expose the heart. You are now looking at the visceral pericardium surrounding the heart. And you'll notice there is a fair amount of adipose tissue that's just deep to this layer, and we're going to have to dissect through that to expose the vasculature of the heart, the coronary vasculature. The next step is to remove the heart from the mediastinum by cutting through the great vessels, the major inflow and outflow vessels for the heart. Now I can start by pulling the heart superiorly and cutting through the inferior vena cava, which is bringing the blood back from the regions of the body inferior to the diaphragm. Okay. And there's really no length to the inferior vena cava. It comes through the diaphragm and immediately enters the right atrium of the heart. Now on the superior end of the heart, I can put my finger through and cut through the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. And do make all these incisions within the pericardial cavity to make sure that you don't damage any structures that we want to have you look at later in the dissection. Again, I'll take a scissors and cut through the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So those major outflow vessels have now been cut. The last large vessel that I need to cut through is the superior vena cava, returning blood from the upper limbs and the head back to the right atrium. So again, I will cut through that and the heart will be free. Okay. We've already cut through the pulmonary veins when we removed the lungs, so we just need to bluntly dissect those from their penetration through the pericardial cavity so that we can pull the heart out. We've put the heart and the sternum back in place on the chest so that you can get an appreciation for how much the heart is protected by the sternum and by the thoracic cage. Now you'll notice that the heart is positioned asymmetrically within the chest so that on the right side it projects approximately an inch toward the right from the edge of the sternum. It's important to have an idea of where the heart is positioned so that you can predict whether or not the heart is going to be affected by a puncture wound or other type of wound to the anterior chest wall. If you did get some sort of an injury in this position, it would be the right atrium that you see here that would be most likely affected. On the left side, we see that the heart projects more like 3 inches from the left edge of the sternum, and it's the right ventricle and the left ventricle that potentially could be damaged or punctured by a wound to this region of the chest.
Well, I hope that cadaver video helped you visualize the thoracic cavity and the serous membranes of the heart and lung a little bit better. And I hope you were following along and listening to some directional terms as she was going through these structures: medial, lateral, superior, inferior. So the more you hear people talking and using these anatomical terms, the better it will be for you. So that's it for Introduction to Anatomy. And next we are going to be starting with our tissues, specifically epithelial tissue.